I'd first like to thank the Fondazione Intercultura for inviting me. I'm honored to be here, and this is fantastic already. I have to also say I'm also pleased and honored to be following Ulf Hannertz for reasons that will become evident during my talk. And I'll be using PowerPoint slides for this, and for the people in the back, don't worry, I don't think I'm going to be saying anything that depends on you being able to see it or read it, okay? So it's more of a help from me. Okay, so it's up there. Okay, so let's get the course advertising out of the way first. This talk is largely, not entirely, largely based on a book I just published at the end of last year, and the German version's coming out in 2 weeks. I'll use the superdiversity thing as a springboard to getting to complexity. I'll just talk a little about superdiversity at the first. And I know my publisher probably doesn't like to talk about this, but you don't have to buy the book. It's all downloadable, open access online as well. Okay, advertising out of the way. Okay, as I say, so I'll talk about the superdiversity thing just as a springboard to complexity, and you'll see how I get there. So superdiversity has been invoked a couple of times, and it's a concept that I first published on in 2007 when I was working in the UK and analyzing all sorts of migration data. I'm mainly a migration scholar. And I was noticing some things happening to migration in the UK that I've gone on to research over the last 15 years, and these are global processes as well. That is, we've seen a sea change, a major change, transformation of global migration. We're seeing increasing movements of people from more varied backgrounds, national, ethnic, linguistic, and religious backgrounds than we've ever had in history. More people coming from more different backgrounds, going to more places than ever before in history. That was one big kind of breakthrough looking at all this data. The other thing, though, was at the same time, a number of other things were changing as well, not just all of these backgrounds, ethnicity, nationality, language, and so forth were moving around more. But we had a diversification of migration channels that people were going through. More people coming from these different backgrounds, coming as high-skilled workers, or as students, or as family members, or as refugees, asylum seekers, or as undocumented workers, in very different combinations. Likewise, people gaining different legal statuses, different gender balances in all of these different flows from different ethnic, national, and other backgrounds, age ratios, class, and human capital. So the idea was that diversity wasn't what it used to be, that for all these ways and the ways that all of these kinds of criteria were changing and playing upon each other in intersectional ways, I felt that we had to talk about them differently. The old models of talking about multiculturalism in terms of large groups coming in certain basic modes of migration didn't fit the data we were seeing anymore. So I came up with this concept of superdiversity to try to summarize all of these intersectional, hesitating to use the word complex, combinations of social categories that have happened in global migration over the last 30 years. And the super of superdiversity doesn't mean super powerful or something. I meant it to talk about we're seeing modes of diversity that supersede previous forms of diversity that we had, because of all of these new combinations of elements. Okay, so since I published that, kind of to my surprise, the concept has gone viral, we might say. It's been cited around 10,000 times by scholars from across the social sciences and even into business studies and history and especially sociolinguistics in education as well. But also what I noticed, I haven't read all the 10,000 citations, but I did some research with a couple of research assistants looking at all these different ways the concept of superdiversity was being taken up like fire across the social sciences. And I found that people were using it in very different ways than I had originally intended. And I thought that was interesting, just to see the life of a concept after it's been born. And I think one of the most compelling things that I saw, though, is that, again, across the social sciences, people were picking up the superdiversity thing, the concept, to talk about very different things by way of how different aspects of society were becoming more complex. And they didn't have the language to quite talk about it, whatever their particular field was, sociolinguistics or neighborhood dynamics or classrooms, workplaces. And they wanted to talk about ways that things are getting more complex. They didn't quite have the language, and so they grabbed the superdiversity thing. And that's been great for me in my citation index. But again, they were using the language, the concept in different sorts of ways to talk about complex migration flows, complex social identities, new complex social formations taking place, again, in neighborhoods, workplaces, and schoolrooms. So I thought that was particularly interesting that people were doing that. And this phenomenon was kind of summed up by the late, great German sociologist Ulrich Beck, who said over the last decades, the cultural, social, and political landscapes of diversity are changing radically, what all of our speakers have been talking about. But we still use old maps to orient ourselves. In other words, my main thesis is we do not even have the language through which contemporary superdiversity in the world can be described, conceptualized, understood, explained, and researched. Okay, so again, he was pointing out that we need new language to be able to talk about all these new complex social processes, social manifestations, social configurations that were coming out. So I thought, well, that's an interesting thing. Obviously, there's a lot of interest. People are trying to understand and come up with, ways of talking about and describing these new forms. And so what I've done over the past couple of years, and this all goes into to the book as well, I've tried to, perhaps very amateurishly, tried to understand, well, what does complexity science actually try to describe? If social scientists are using complexity, what do sort of real complexity scientists, physicists, biologists, and others talk about by way of complexity science? And so I've tried to read up and educate myself, talk to a number of colleagues, and I've sort of derived these 8 key points of what I think complexity science is trying to say. And I realize this is a really risky thing to do, not least because we have a lot of complexity experts in the room, as it were, and we'll be talking in the next couple of days with them about complexity science. I hope they won't disagree with me terribly, but I do want to spend just a minute going through all of these because I'll come back to them a couple of times in the rest of the lecture. So what are we talking about in complexity science? How do complexity scientists understand something? Well, first of all, complexity science is about certain systems comprised of numerous elements. And one of the first kind of premises of complexity science is anytime you have an increase in the number of elements within a system, you're going to have more complex dynamics, more things happening within it. And this was the key thesis made in one of the seminal articles that sort of kicked off in many ways, within physics anyways, complexity science. This was a piece in the journal Science by P.W. Anderson, 1972. The article was just called More is Different. And I thought that was brilliant because the title is the same as the content, is the same as the conclusion. More is different. Whenever you have more elements added to any system, you're going to kick off complexity dynamics. Likewise, if there's an increase in the differentiation of characteristics of any of the elements in a particular system, you're going to kick off new complexity dynamics, which I'll talk about. If there's an increase in the relationship and the interdependence between elements, you're going to have more complex systems. And I should say, by complex systems, we can be talking about anything from weather systems to ecosystems in a particular environment to social systems. Let's think about crowd behavior, okay? Anytime you have an increase in number or differentiation or interdependence of agents, you're going to kick off complex dynamics, new processes. And these sorts of processes lead to high contingency. It depends on what's happening with those elements to what's going to happen to the whole system. You have the emergence of new systems, kind of almost naturally, they say, forming out of these systems, as it were, thrown into, the old language used to be disequilibrium, until a new equilibrium, a new system emerges from a system changed by number, differentiation of characteristics, or interdependence. The emergence of new systems are often talked about as self-organization, but some of the key points are that the trajectories, what's going to happen to the system, is usually completely unpredictable and leading to uncertainty. So you always find in complexity science people ending up with ideas of uncertainty. We actually don't know how a lot of complex dynamics are going to play out. And this is really important to think about when we're trying to apply complexity to changing social systems. We can't predict exactly how they're going to play out in a neighborhood, in a workplace, in a schoolroom, let's say. So these are just some basic elements, and as I say, we'll come back to those. And I hope the experts in the audience aren't cringing at my attempt to summarize complexity science. Okay, so something I do know a little bit more about is how complexity has been talked about in anthropology. Many years ago, when I was an anthropology professor at Oxford, I taught a course on anthropology of cultural complexity, and we spent a lot of time, not solely, but at the beginning of the course anyways, talking about notions of complex societies. This was a big theme in a lot of 20th century anthropology, about how complex societies arose. It was a very evolutionary approach. And you've probably heard it in your school books or something, moving from bands to chiefdoms and tribes, moving on to states, into empires. This was the idea of the emergence of complex societies in social anthropology. And the idea was of ever more complex modes of social organization. This idea of social organization is one of the key things I want to put in your head right now, because we'll come back to this too. The idea that the way we arrange ourselves changes over time. The way we arrange ourselves, what we mean by social organization, have to do with things like hierarchy and status, occupational specialization, political functions and power, and how we use our resources and share our resources or hoard our resources. All of these are modes of social organization. And so a lot of 20th century anthropology and archaeology traces how different systems of social organization around these sorts of themes, hierarchy, power, resource control, emerge into more and more complex forms of social organization, okay? So that was the basic idea, and of course a lot of it had to do with population and the kinds of traits that anthropologists, let's say in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were looking at, had to do with the emergence of things like markets, technology, architecture, irrigation, and so forth. But these often had to do with population size. So there's that idea of increase in the number of elements in a system, okay? And again, all of these had to do with social organization as the main way that complexity was thought about in a lot of 20th century anthropology. And again, I think you'll recognize these sorts of elements of complexity theory that I mentioned earlier on: increase in number of agents, differentiation of characteristics, of people having more or less status, different access to resources, etc., and different relationships between people. So these were all modes of the complexity of social organization that a lot of this kind of anthropology existed on. For reasons I won't get into now, that's this way of thinking in anthropology has been itself superseded by other ways of thinking. But I'm just saying that this idea of complexity in social organization was a dominant way of thinking for a long time. Even in contemporary anthropology now, things just published within the last couple of years, there's a lot of interest in anthropology on complexity, and it's, again, particularly in terms of system change, of relationships of elements. Now there's a lot of interest in human, non-human relationships, so the relationships of humans and the natural environment, relations of humans to artificial intelligence and robots and so forth. But I would say that the idea of social organization is still at the heart of these uses of complexity in a lot of anthropology. And I find it hugely interesting. but for what I'll go into the next couple of minutes, I don't think that's very sufficient. Because I think we need a change of thinking, which has already been brought about. The changing perspective that I take, moving from social organization to something else, the way we think about complexity in society, owes a lot to these three anthropologists, Frederick Barth, Ulf Hannertz, and Thomas Holland Eriksson. And I'm not just putting this up here because I knew these guys would be in the audience today. This is all in the book, okay? So it's just a nice coincidence you guys are here. Some of the things that I've really learned from these three Scandinavians, for some reason I haven't figured out yet. We need to have a conversation over a beer about why three Scandinavians made what I think is this hugely important change in perspective in thinking about complexity. Their idea is complexity is not just about social organization, resource controls, stratification, hierarchies. It's about the complexification of what's going on in our heads, what meaning systems we have, what concepts we use. Those are getting more complex at the same time, and this has a direct relationship to modes of social organization as well. For me, this is a paradigm shift. After all those years of teaching about evolutionary theories of complex societies, I think this is an important breakthrough, and the rest of my talk will be pretty much along those lines. So, like I said, Ulf, I hope you're cringing with embarrassment here, because I'm like the novice at the master's feet here. Also in that course I used to teach at Oxford, Ulf's book on cultural complexity was like our Bible, okay? Because, and it's even, the subtitle is fantastic as well, Studies in the Social Organization of Meaning. Again, this idea that what we carry around in our heads, the meanings, the concepts, the values, are in direct relationship with the forms of social organization that we have as well. That meanings within any cultural system or society are unevenly distributed through populations, through gender, through age groups, through education, through occupation. They're directly related to stratification, that people in different social positions have different perspectives, have different meanings that they use to sort their way through society. And that the meanings that we carry around in our heads imbue the social relationships that we have. You see what I mean? This is moving from this almost kind of materialistic view of complexity as social organization to a really important one that combines the social with the cognitive. And for me, some of the key meanings that are complexifying right now have to do with the social categories we use right now as well. So that's the shift to the next session, where I'll talk about complexity and social categories, and how the social categories that we rely on every day right now are hugely complexifying right in front of our eyes. And we're still in a state of emergence. We don't quite know where they're going right now. But I just want to start this section with this quote from a couple of top social psychologists at Yale in a piece that they wrote, also calling for a paradigm shift within the field of the discipline of social psychology. And they say the world is much more diverse on multiple dimensions at many levels, typified by the salience of differences and their dynamic intersections. And for me, salience of differences, difference is one of the key modes of social categorization that we have right now. What are the kinds of differences that we see and that we sort our society by? And right now, the idea of difference is going through quite a massive complexification and change right now. Now, what kind of social categories am I talking about? These kind, especially gender, sexuality, religion, race, ethnicity, and language. There are things happening right now to all of these categories that are complexifying and are coming out of changes in social organization, but are also going to hugely affect the way that we organize ourselves socially in a very Hannertzian manner, I would add. So, again, these are some of the key categories that are in a lot of our attention right now, in politics not least, in public thinking, in social movements, race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexuality, disability, age, class, religion, and legal status. And I contend and show in the book how each one of these is changing right now. Because in each one of these broad social categories, we're seeing increasing number, meanings, combinations, and transformations of what we mean by each one of these kinds of social categories. And as I say, they're coming out of changes in society, and they are contributing to new changes in society in ever more complex ways. Now, one of the ways that they are transforming is we're putting the idea of trans in front of a lot of these categories. So we talk about the transnational, also, by the way, another Ulf Hannard's book, Transnational Connections. Transgender, transsexual, transracial, and translanguage. In sociolinguistics, translanguaging is a very intriguing concept. And here, if you're interested in this idea of how these basic categories are changing by when we affix the word trans to it, I really recommend a book by a friend and colleague, Rogers Brubaker from UCLA, just called Trans. And he also talks about that we're going through an age of unsettled identities. And I'm not entirely satisfied by the idea of unsettled identities. I think we're in an era of multiplying, making, unmaking, and mixing of categories, and contention of categories as well, which I'll get to in a minute. Key social categories are changing in important ways. Okay, so just one example. I don't have time. This is another advertisement for the book. If you're interested in how all of these categories are changing, sorry, you have to look at that book. But here's just one example that I drawn from the most recent United States Census. And just between the census year 2010 and 2020, the number of people identifying as multiracial or mixed more than tripled. And why did that happen? How could you suddenly have a more than tripling of the number of people adopting that as their identity or their social category? Is it the fact that there were more multiracial or let's call it other sort of background babies? It's not necessarily only fixed on race. Are Americans rethinking their identities? Is it because the census was changed in 2020, allowing you to tick more boxes than previously? Well, according to the New York Times, they say the answer is all of the above. There were more babies, there were more people rethinking identities, and there was a change in the census, okay? But the idea was that, again, that they say there was a meaningful widening of options people had to say who they felt they were. And I think this is where we're at right now. Social categories are changing. People are rethinking how they want to describe themselves, how they want to be affiliated, who they want to be with. Categories are also becoming less exclusive. The way people see themselves is changing. That's from The Economist, also commenting on this big change in the US Census. Okay, so something is going on out there. We're seeing an unfixing of a lot of categories. Now, in response to that, we're having a backlash by people who are themselves very unsettled by the idea of unfixing. So in certain voices on the right, across the world, we're seeing a backlash against mixing and trans and the unfixing of categories. People who want to put gender and sexuality and race and ethnicity and language back in their boxes. And I would say this dynamic is also part of complexification, okay? It's part of the emergent new social forms that are going on that we have to stir into the mix. The fact that there is a backlash against the unfixing of social categories. Okay, so again, just a kind of summary that we're seeing a complexification of social meanings and categories, more intersectionalities, new trans and mixed identities, a new public salience, social movements, contestation in public about the nature of many of the key social categories that we have today, and increased self-awareness, people trying to rethink their own identities and social categories that they belong to. And in good complexity fashion, where this is going is unpredictable. We're in a stage right now of emergence, of new social forms of complex social organization taking place. These are kind of in a feedback. Again, a lesson I learned from Ulf and his work. Social meanings and social organization are always in a kind of feedback. And again, I throw in the lessons I gained anyways from from complexity theory, increasing the number of agents, differentiation, interdependence. These all relate to what's going on with social categories as well as with social organization right now. And we're in a situation of unpredictability and uncertainty as to where this is going. There are various ways that people are trying to steer this emergence, but as we see there's pushback as well from certain quarters. And I think another concept that I've been quite interested in, two leading sociologists, feminist sociologists, one from the US, one from England, independently, as far as I know, came up with the idea of complex inequalities. That when you mix complex emergent forms of socialization, of social organization, and complex social categories, you have ever more complex forms of inequality, of economic inequality, and political inequality, social inequality as well, due to what they talk about as multiple categorical intersectionalities. The way that all these different social categories that we belong to combine can play into new forms of discrimination and inequality. I just won't go into that, but just flag that as a important and interesting concept. Okay, the final thing I want to flag up stemming from this is another field, again from social psychology, that I've been particularly inspired by, interested in, is a set of theory called social identity complexity theory, otherwise known as multiple social categorization, initially kicked off by two American social psychologists, Rokas and Brewer. And they looked at, experimentally in a number of studies, prompting people to look at their own multiple social categorization within them. All of us belong to multiple social categories all the time, which includes, ethnicity, sexuality, gender, and so forth, but also different roles, different affiliations on different scales as well. And what they found is when people become more conscious of their own social category complexity, their own multiplicity, they're better able to recognize it in others, and that leads to more positive interactions with others. And in some ways that it seems like a natural thing, but I mean this is now demonstrated through lots of interesting experimental work. So the idea becomes, okay, we should get people to understand and to introspect on their own complexity. Complexity theory belongs in here with each one of us. And this has immediate effect, as I say, on the way people relate to others. And so there's your social organization kind of dimension as well. So for me, what this boils down to is we need to get the message across that everyone belongs to more than one social category. We have to fight the idea of putting people in single category boxes. And every social category is comprised of people who belong to other social categories. So these seem like self-evident, but we lose track of this all the time in a lot of public discourse and a lot of politics. Everyone belongs to more than one social category. Every social category is comprised of people who belong also to other social categories. And this fits entirely into the views of Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen, who we've heard from earlier. The hope of harmony in the contemporary world lies to a great extent in a clearer understanding of the pluralities of human identity and in the appreciation that they cut across each other and work against the sharp separation along one single hardened line of impenetrable division. And again, this leads us back to the movements of people, largely on the right, who want to get back to fixity and singular categories. And if complexity is to fully emerge and we're to take advantage of it for ways that we've seen, again, in social identity complexity theory, are positive, have positive outcomes, we need to promote these sorts of ideas too and get people to think about their own multiple social categories. And I know that this is an educational foundation, and I think a lot of people in the educational field, perhaps teachers here, one way of doing this is, I don't know, in Italy if you use this, but in a lot of American and Canadian schools, especially in high schools, they use these social identity charts. That is, they get students to sit down and list in this sort of form all the different kinds of social categories that they belong to, as a way of stimulating the self-introspection about multiple category complexity. And then you can even take that further to say, okay, which social categories are self-asserted by the person and which social categories are put on you by the rest of society. And that also triggers various kinds of introspection, and you can get students to talk to each other about some of the categories which they then realize that they overlap with. And again, in social identity complexity theory, this is shown to stimulate more positive attitudes to people from all kinds of different backgrounds, when you realize that that person is just as complex as I am. Okay, last thing, in conclusion, whoops, there's that book again. In the conclusion, I make a call for more complexity thinking. This is the kind of complexity thinking we have to get the general public to recognize. Complexity thinking, an approach, a set of tools, and a vocabulary borrowed from the natural sciences to conceptualize better these multiplicities of meaning and relationship, is not just of value for social understanding, not just for the social scientists, but for ordinary individuals to gain a more coherent view of society and social change, a positive appreciation of others, and a further understanding of themselves. And you can't ask for more than that. This is all coming together in what my friend Thomas calls for complexity as a way of seeing, okay? That if we get people to recognize what complexity is all about, and they can see the complexity in the world around them all the time, it helps give them a kind of navigational tool for how to proceed in life, how to treat others, how to reorganize society. And I think that is just a great kind of mantra. We need complexity as a way of seeing. Okay, and Thomas, even though you're an esteemed colleague and a good friend, I'm not going to give you the last word. I'm going to save that for Michael Palin, who I'm a big fan of, who says the complexity and diversity of the world is the hope for the future. And I think that's a positive message that I want to leave us all with, and hopefully we can talk all along these lines over the next couple of days. Thanks very much.